For Reaper Metal Productions, I am Adam of Unbaptized Records, here to make a brand new video for you today. Again, coming at you from the void, middle of the night after the Malignancy concert that I went to. I am doing my top 25 albums of all time, and I already showed you 25 through 13. We'll talk about them, jump to you. And of course, since I'm sitting in my car in the void, I will not be doing any show and tell. You'll just have to bear with me and just imagine I am holding the CDs or LPs in my hand. And hopefully you have a copy of most of these too, because most of these are fairly common records. So maybe not a huge surprise to people, but I am going to now go through 12 through 1 in order. So again, if you are watching this now and you didn't watch the previous video, go back, watch 25 through 13, and then switch back over to this video. So number 12 is the English band Gore Rotted with the album Mutilated in Minutes. This is a band that I used to listen to so much for whatever reason at college. So around 2009, I just remember I would have my headphones in on my iPod going between classes, and either Mutilated in Minutes or, well, I like all three of their albums. But I definitely like Only Tools and Corpses and Mutilated in Minutes the most, and then their third one, I forgot the name of it, but that one's definitely a bit of a downgrade. But these first two are fantastic, and if you do not know Gore Rotted and you like gore grind, especially kind of the way that I just love the dual vocals, the way that bands like Dying Fetus and Exhumed do it, where they have like the high pitch and the low growling. So your Matt Harvey highs and then your Ross Sewage or Mike Beam lows. Very similar to how Gore Rotted does it, but they have such heavy UK accents that even when they articulate the highs, it's almost impossible to understand what the hell they're saying. And the lyrics and the song titles are really creative, and they're very like English slang. Use word like shagged and I think a few other things, but it's just funny because it's just over the top ridiculous with the song titles and just the way that like it almost sounds like they're speaking gibberish, especially the higher vocal guy. And then the intro to the song Only Tools and Corpses, it starts off like almost like a jazz song, and then it goes dives directly into this just gore grind masterpiece. So if you get a chance, and if you haven't heard Gore Rotted yet and you like gore metal type music, gore grind, death grind, sort of even the UK punky, like almost imagine a band like if you had Napalm Death, but it was like gore grind instead of just regular grindcore. That's kind of what this band reminds me of. It's just got that super UK edge to it. Definitely check them out. Again, either Mutilated in Minutes or Only Tools and Corpses. If you've never heard them at all before, just do yourself a favor with nothing other than what I'm telling you and just look up the song Only Tools and Corpses. Just listen to that, and I'd be curious. Tell me what you think. It's such an interesting song. Next, number 11, we have the band Misery Index with the album The Killing Gods. This is another band that I have mentioned before. I'm super glad that, as much as it sucks that parts of the band Dying Fetus broke off at one point, whether it was for sour reasons or they just wanted to do their own thing, I'm really glad that they formed the band Misery Index. I know I've mentioned it before, kind of drawing the parallel to when Mustaine was kicked out of Metallica. You still had his awesome work on guitar coming through with Kill 'Em All. And then a little bit on Ride the Lightning, because he still had some riffs that came out on that album. And then Megadeth. So if you were a fan of, speeding thrash metal in the early 80s, and you really liked the way that Mustaine's music sounded, if you like the way his vocals sound, it's kind of weird to me. I don't understand how you could. Well, maybe the first few albums, but after that, it was just absolutely horrendous. But at least for the first few records, if you loved his guitar, which I imagine you definitely did, then you kind of got two bands. You got Metallica, and you still got the riffs that he wrote from his early days, and then you have him played on Kill 'Em All, and then Kirk Hammett, for better or for worse, takes over and it does a decent job, I guess, at early Metallica. And then you also still have Megadeth's music, so you kind of get double. It's kind of the same for me with Dying Fetus and Misery Index. So they both kind of bring something slightly different to their music, but definitely worth checking out if you are a Dying Fetus fan and for whatever reason you haven't heard of Misery Index yet. Check out their first few albums. I think you're not going to be disappointed. It's a bit more grindy, but definitely similar vibe to Dying Fetus, so worth checking out. Then number 10 is Morbid Angel. This one was kind of similar to Cryptopsy. It was kind of hard to choose between the 2A albums, Abominations and Altars. And then some people saying, well, Abominations isn't really an album, it's an EP. You can kind of, for number 10, if you really want to, just call it, instead of Abominations or Altars, we'll call it Abominations of Madness. How about that? We'll just take both albums, put them together as a double CD. That should basically exist if you wanted to, especially considering, after Thy Kingdom Come and after technically Abominations, they went in alphabetical order other than having 2A albums. There you go. If you want to resolve that and just have one album for each letter of the alphabet other than Thy Kingdom Come, just call it Abominations of Madness and just combine the two, and then you definitely have a perfect 10 out of 10, and you don't have to argue over which album's better. You just say that they're one just congruent album that is perfect in and of itself. So it's kind of cheating, but hey, you know what? It's a creative way of getting around having to choose. Next might be a surprise, especially to the underground people, but if you know anything about my music taste and my back patch on my vest, this one would not be surprising. It is the band Goatwhore with their album Constricting Rage of the Merciless. So I consider this band, I guess, sort of like wimpy black thrash. If I were to make a video, which I might someday, and I might have mentioned this, I do forget, but imagine coming up with a list of bands that would be good gateway bands. Bands like Korn, Disturbed, Slipknot, especially for the early 90s, early to mid 90s, get thrown around as sort of the gateway bands. It's like you listen to them, you discover that there's more out there than just the radio music, and then you go, okay, these guys are heavier than like literally just a mainstream rock and roll and rap and hip hop, but they're nowhere near as heavy or as extreme or anything as most of the metal out there. So you get into them, again, your Slipknots, your Korn, and then they're your gateway to listening to bands like I mentioned in the previous video, this video, your Gore Rotteds, your Destructors from Australia, stuff like that. And then you could sort of toss them aside. I kind of want to make a list of bands that I think are a caliber or a step above that, the Slipknots and Korns, that are good gateway bands that maybe you don't necessarily listen to for a year or two and then kind of throw them off. Like a band like Lamb of God comes to mind, where you might listen to them because your friend showed them to you, and then you hear them for a year, and then you start listening to heavier stuff, and then if you happen to have a Lamb of God CD in your collection 10 years later, the underground people go, oh, why is that there? They throw it out there. Like, I'm kind of embarrassed. Why did I even think this was good at some point? Well, what about a band that maybe you wouldn't be so embarrassed about? They're kind of a good gateway band to instead of just showing someone the Iron Maidens and the Motorheads and Venoms and stuff like that. That's great. I mean, you should go back to the classics, but maybe a more modern band that's not quite as embarrassing as a Limp Bizkit or as a Lamb of God or something. That's sort of like a good entry-level band, but that maybe 10 years from now, when you are past the entry level by 9.5 years, you go back and look at it and go, that's, not that bad of a band. I kind of like them. I see bands like the Black Dahlia Murder, kind of like that. Revocations, kind of like that, where it's sort of easy listening, but I wouldn't say that's on the same level of like Slipknot or Korn. I would say Goatwhore is kind of like that, where yes, if you've been into the underground scene for 20 years, you're not going to pick up a Goatwhore album, but if you've never really listened to metal before, they're kind of a good place to start. And again, I don't think in 10 years, Constricting Rage of the Merciless album in your CD pile is really embarrassing. I mean, I personally enjoy them. I don't really care what people think of them, but I think that they're a pretty good starter band. And again, what I just said, something you wouldn't necessarily be embarrassed about listening to 10 years later or having a patch on your vest, whereas the Slipknots, System of a Down, shit like that people rip on, I can kind of see why that's sort of like, okay, you listen to it to get you into the quote-unquote heavier stuff, and then you kind of throw that out and just say, yeah, that was a good gateway, but now let's close the gate, just move on. So I love that album. They played a few of the songs from it live when I saw them. I saw them with Spider the other year. They were in Connecticut twice. I saw them both times. I thought they were fantastic. So maybe you just have to give them a listen. Again, they're not going to be the greatest things since sliced bread, and they're not going to turn a lot of heads of the underground people, but I think they're definitely better than some people probably give them credit for. Number 8 is the band Deicide, which the album I am choosing might be a little bit of a surprise because it's a much later album, but it's Scars of the Crucifix. And no, I am not choosing this album because it's the first I heard by them. I did hear their first two albums first. I just absolutely love this album. I think this one goes really hard, especially for later discography deicide. Like songs like the title, Scars of the Crucifix, but like Go Now, Your Lord is Dead, and Fuck Your God. I mean, those songs are ripping, and I love them, and I think it's a great album. If you kind of listen to the first two or the first four and stopped, do not skip this album. Even if it's the only other album you listen to, it's still got the Hoffman Brothers. It's the last one with them on it. It doesn't sound anything like the last two they did for Roadrunner. I would say if you're going to only listen to earlier albums, sure, listen to the first four deicide, but do not give up Scars of the Crucifix. Add that one. If that's the fifth and only other one you listen to, I think it's definitely worth it. Yeah, people might say it's kind of got the flowery guitar in some parts, like, in the middle of the song Scars of the Crucifix, but yeah, Fuck Your God, listen to that. Tell me that that's got some flowery music. I don't think so. I think it's a great album. So next, number 7, Cannibal Corpse, with a very obvious choice, Tomb of the Mutilated. It's kind of hard not to pick that. I mean, other than maybe their first album, it's hard to really pick anything other than Tomb of the Mutilated. There's a reason that people talk about it so much. There's a reason that it's on most people's top lists, and if you like Cannibal Corpse, there's a reason that most people choose it as their favorite. It's kind of hard not to. I don't think that there's any Corpse Grinder album that beats it. I mean, Bloodthirst, maybe. It's pretty good. Domain of Death, that one's okay too. But I don't really think anything beats Tomb, again, other than possibly Eaten Back to Life. Definitely not Butchered at Birth. I think Paul's drumming on that album absolutely suck. It's kind of hard to listen to, unfortunately. And then The Bleeding, I think, musically is pretty good. I'm not a real fan of Chris's sort of vocal fry highs on that. I just don't care for it. I mean, The Bleeding is still good, but honestly, I'd much rather pick Create to Kill than The Bleeding. So that's just me. But Tomb of the Mutilated, kind of an easy one to go for. And then number 6, this one's also a very obvious choice. Sarcophago, INRI. So really not much has to be said about that. It's a classic album. 10 out of 10. One of the best albums to come out of the 80s. Very easy choice. Now 5 through 1, that's going to be a little different than probably most people's list. So if there's bands that you haven't heard so far, you're thinking, oh, is he going to put a classic like Maiden or something? No, that's not on this list. The last 5 are probably going to be disappointing to most people, but they are my favorite, and I'm going to be unapologetic for them. So they are what they are, and I like what I like, and you like what you like. So number 5 is Toxic Holocaust with An Overdose of Death. They are an awesome band. My favorite song of all time is the song Acid Fuzz. Now, not off this album, it's off Chemistry of Consciousness, but they're a band I discovered fairly late, especially given they are my top 5. So 2 of these 5 bands I discovered around 2016, and the rest of them are bands that I've been a fan of since I pretty much started listening to metal around 2004, 2005, so going on 20 years now. So it makes sense that they're in my top 5. But Toxic Holocaust is a fairly newer band for me, again, coming on 9-10 years now. But An Overdose of Death is amazing. I mean, I love all their albums. The first album is also amazing, but An Overdose of Death is definitely my favorite. So number 4 is Dying Fetus with the album Descent into Depravity. This was also an interesting one because I had listened to them since about 2004 or 05. I did kind of start from the beginning, so that this wasn't a band where I started from when the music came out, from like when I discovered it. Obviously I wasn't around, well, I was alive, but I wasn't listening to metal like 93, 94, so like Bathe in Entrails, the really early stuff, I believe that came out around then. I obviously wasn't listening to music when I was 2 or 3 years old, definitely not death metal or brutal death metal or anything, but I did kind of go and listen to their discography in order, just for whatever reason. Descent into Depravity stuck with me, ended up being my favorite. But really anything from that and before, I could say is just amazing. Like it's almost hard to choose. So I definitely am one of those people that enjoys their early stuff as well. It's not like it's just their newer stuff, but Dying Fetus has been in my top 5 favorites since I first started listening to metal, and there's a reason for it. I think they get a lot of crap for being too slammy maybe, or having that sort of hardcore influence. I don't see that as a problem, so God forbid that metal has some groove to it. all right. So it has a little bit of that slam. I mean, okay, I don't really see a problem with that. Actually, speaking of the concert, Malignancy just came from, I was talking to Ronnie about that, and of course, if you know anything about him, you saw the interview with J-Dog, he was surprised that, like, people were ripping on flat brim hats and stuff, and I'm like, got the New York attitude. I mean, obviously, Dying Fetus is from New York, but they kind of have that, like, New York vibe, even though I think they're from Baltimore, Maryland. They still kind of have that vibe to them, like kind of the suffocation or internal bleeding, or, the malignancies, the morticians. I don't really see anything wrong with mixing in that style. I mean, what do you want, every metal band to sound exactly the same? I don't know. I don't really see having a little bit of groove or a little bit of slam or a little bit of that, whatever it is that gives it that taste to it. I don't see that as a problem at all, and Dying Fetus especially. They have this awesome blend where, especially the early stuff was really brutal, and then as time went on, they're still pretty brutal and have the dual vocals, but they're also really technical, and the drumming and the guitar is super all over the place, but it's still heavy. There aren't too many bands that could pull that off as well as they do and have the dual vocals and everything. So I think Dying Fetus is the full package, and I don't know, man. I think they're an awesome band. I think that they get way too much shit. Maybe their fan base is deplorable, whatever. I don't really care. When I'm listening to a CD, the fan base isn't sitting in my car with me. If I'm at a concert, that's 0.001% of my entire listening experience of a band. The majority of the time I'm listening to them, it's on CD, tape, 7-inch, record, by myself in my car, on Spotify, on YouTube, or whatever. I'm not surrounded by the fans. I could give a shit less what the fans are like. It doesn't really make a difference to me. And if I'm at a show and 90% of the people look like a bunch of jabroni jackasses, okay, whatever. I'm not experiencing them. I'm experiencing the show. I really don't care. So it doesn't really make a difference for me. So I love Dying Fetus, the band. Well, yeah, they're great. So they're my number 4, Descent into Depravity. Number 3 is the Pizza Thrash band. Oh boy, Municipal Waste with their second album, Hazardous Mutation. Again, I don't think you have to sit there and have your arms crossed and no smile and just be pissed off all the time and listening to the most angry, satanic, aggressive, gory music ever, which if you want to listen to it, fine. I listen to plenty of it. But every once in a while, it's okay to have a little fun. Listen to something a little more lighthearted with some awesome stage energy, and that is the band Municipal Waste. This was also a hard album to choose, but the more I think about it, songs like Abusement Park and Mind Eraser, they're just such absolute bangers. I love them every time they come on, especially if I'm like hyped up on coffee and I'm driving somewhere and I have, like, let's say a Spotify playlist on random and something off their album comes on. I just want to like punch the steering wheel and drive 100 miles an hour and just scream and throw my fist into the air way more than I do with a lot of other music. So I don't know. I think it's great. Again, if you don't like the Pizza Thrash, fine. You know what? More for me. I'm not really worried about it. Number 2 is the band Exhumed with Gore Metal. So getting down to the last few on my list, like I said with Dying Fetus as well, these are bands that I had listened to now for 20 years. So 3 of these 5 bands, Dying Fetus, Exhumed, and then the next one. These are bands that have been my favorite, stood the test of time, 20 years now, and Gore Metal is easily the best thing they've ever done. I love everything by them, but this is definitely an example of the first is the best. I have not heard the re-recording. I can't really tell you if it sounds better or worse, but I didn't even care that much for the repress or remaster of Gore Metal. I would still want an original pressing of the album on vinyl because I feel like it would be worth owning because I like it that much. The songs are amazing, the album art, everything about it. It's just one of the most perfect death metal, whatever you even want to call it. It's not really gore metal, I guess, or gore grind or whatever, but one of the most amazing, perfect albums of the late 90s. I think Gore Metal is a perfect 10 out of 10, and I just don't think that they need to remake it. Too bad they did, but it is what it is. I definitely would rather have a repressing of the original, not remastered, nothing like that. Just regular old repress of the original than a remaster or a remake, but kind of got at least 2 of the 3 of those, so that's good. And then number 1, if you know me, this is not a surprise whatsoever. It's the band Cattle Decapitation with their album Monolith of Inhumanity. Really, not much needs to be said about this from my perspective, because again, if you know me, you know this is my favorite record. It's cool to me, at least from the fans of Cow Decapitation, because a lot of the newer fans and the older fans can usually agree that this is probably their favorite album, which is interesting because if you line it up with all, I think, 10 of their records, this is like number 7. This album came out in 2012, I believe, and the band's been around technically since 1996. I guess we would more so say 98 because 96 was the demo, but the demo was more so like Locust, the band The Locust. It doesn't really sound like Cow Decapitation does. Then when Travis joined the band, and with their first 2 releases in 99, 2000, that really solidified the band's sound, and then they went from more of like gore grind, carcass worship to just kind of death grind or death metal or whatever, really solidifying their sound with Humanure, which by the way is a super close second. It was honestly really hard to pick Monolith over Humanure. They're basically coin toss, but I'm going to go with Monolith because that's the one people probably know better. But for the most part, most people agree that that's their favorite album, their best album. And I do think that part is cool because, I guess to my point, an album that came so late in a career for a band is agreed upon as the favorite, the best by the old fans and the new fans for the most part. That's pretty rare. Usually the old heads like the first album or the demos, and then the people who just got into them a couple weeks ago, they like the newest album. So for the older, newer fans to come together for the most part and just organically decide that an album that came out in the later half of the mid, discography of a band is their favorite, that's kind of cool to me. So Monolith of Inhumanity is fantastic. If you have not heard it, go check it out. But if you've never heard of Cow Decapitation, if you've just never heard of their music, maybe it's going to be a little underwhelming. So I would start with maybe their first 2 releases or Humanure. So that's probably going to give you a little bit of a better taste of their music, I guess, because Monolith is a little bit of a, I guess, brutality downgrade from the earlier stuff, but I guess it really depends on your perspective. So that's my list. Let me know what you think. Rip me in the comments if you thought bands like Goat Horse suck, or tell me that, things like Gore Rotted is a band you never heard before and you're glad I mentioned it and you went and checked out Mutilated in Minutes and now it's a new favorite album. So let me know in the comments section and I'll see you in the next video.